Welcome to Bits About Books, the home for conversations with authors of breakthrough books on sales, marketing, and business. I am your host, Shubhanjan Sarkar, founder of Pitchling, the next generation buyer-seller engagement platform, where our mission is to make buying easy. Our guest today is Ted McKenna, and we speak with him about his bestseller, The Activator Advantage, What Today's Rainmakers Do Differently, which he co-authored with Karen Freeman, Matthew Dixon, and Rory Channer.
There was this sort of dispersion of expertise happening across the market, more boutiques popping up, and just more generally this sense that a declining sense of loyalty, that no longer does it feel like just because you do great work, that guarantees you the next project or the next matter or what have you. And that for a long time was the single premise under which most professional services firms, especially larger professional services firms, hung their hat and sort of ran their strategy against. Like, if I do great work, that ought to bring them back. And so again, all of these things were sort of out there. Our sense was things are shifting, and that's where we started to aim that research. So we launched a big study, as we do, and came up with some interesting findings.
Ted McKenna is a best-selling co-author of The JOLT Effect, How High Performers Overcome Customer Indecision, and The Activator Advantage, What Today's Rainmakers Do Differently, and is a sought-after speaker and advisor to sales, business development, and customer experience teams around the world. An accomplished researcher with work appearing frequently in the pages of Harvard Business Review, Ted is now co-founder and CEO of Selling Innovations, which provides research-based training, enablement, and advisory support to B2B commercial organizations. Ted is also a founding partner of DCM Insights, a company that uses data and research-backed frameworks to help professional services firms improve business development. Prior to co-founding DCMi, Ted held numerous executive leadership positions in product, strategy, research, advisory, and enablement for Tethr, Russell Reynolds, and CEB, now a part of Gartner. Now, on to this insightful session with Ted McKenna. Ted, welcome back to Bits About Books. I'm delighted that we spoke last March, if you remember. And
I know it feels like yesterday, but yes, it's great to be back.
I remember you told me about this new one that you're working on, and I'm so glad that you could find time and we could make it work, and we are here. Thank you and welcome.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
I know this is substantially very different from what JOLT Effect was, so we are not even going to try to draw in a parallel, and it's in depth in an area where I did search. I didn't find another book, and which focused on this space. What made DCMi actually go into this research, and what made you sort of figure that this is something which needs attention?
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. Excited to share more with the audience and dive into so the application in a number of different markets and verticals. I think there are, by the way, some parallels we can talk about, some themes that we saw in the JOLT Effect study that carried over to this new study that we call the Activator, or sometimes you'll hear us refer to as the Rainmaker Genome Project, which is where it started. So this was, probably 2022 or so when we embarked on this study. We did partner with a company called Intab, which is a software provider for professional services and financial services firms. And look, at the end of the day, what we've always really done is to study what high performing commercial individuals do, and then try to extrapolate that, codify what they're doing, and help other people replicate it. We've known for a while that professional services is a little different than B2B sales. These are people who you might call doer sellers, who are sort of part-time salespeople, but also full-time lawyers and accountants and bankers and consultants and talent advisors, you name it. And so what they're selling, their product, is themselves and their expertise and their brain in many respects. And of course, the full breadth of their firm and what have you, but also, again, trying to sort of position themselves. And so consequently, some of our past research was always a little bit of a tough fit in those arenas. And at the same time, there was also this growing sense that things were very, very much shifting in that professional services realm. And then there's even some of our former colleagues have written about this in Harvard Business Review and others about how clients are purchasing differently. That has commoditized some of the ways in which they go to buy what used to be black box, sort of soft skill type purchases. So procurement could get their hands on and make drive cost out of the hard goods elements, even software that they're going to buy, more difficult to do with less tangible goods like a service that is legal services or what have you. But that became less and less true. There was a separate set of evidence that we then validated with some studies about client loyalty and buyers, that there was this sort of dispersion of expertise happening across the market, more boutiques popping up, and just more generally this sense that a declining sense of loyalty. That no longer does it feel like just because you do great work, that guarantees you the next project or the next matter or what have you. And that for a long time was the single premise under which most professional services firms, especially larger professional services firms, hung their hat and sort of ran their strategy against. Like, if I do great work, that ought to bring them back. And so again, all of these things were sort of out there. Our sense was things are shifting, and that's where we started to aim that research. So we launched a big study, as we do, and came up with some interesting findings.
This is very interesting because what you found was that the fundamental premise of loyalty, which was the basis of marketing of these services, so to say, was shifting. I mean, did the study reveal why was it shifting? Was it because the procurement has got involved now, or was it something else?
I think it's a whole series of things. I think it's definitely the more professional purchasing of these less tangible type goods, for sure. I think it was, if you ask buyers, which we did as part of the study, they'll say things like, well, there's no real harm in us shopping for different types of expertise. There's no real harm in us going and getting pitches on this next piece of business. At worst, it's just free consulting, for them, free insight, into the market. But you also hear things like, look, as people, as more committees and more groups make decisions together, you do see more sort of hesitation and, concern about sticking their necks out. So you might hear things like, I might go so far as to recuse myself from this process because I have this relationship with this person, or I went to business school or law school with this individual. And so it's almost gone in the opposite direction, whereas in the past, that might have been a huge benefit, of course. I've known this person for years. Now, given the group dynamics and a lot of the blame that people start to pass around when things go bad, which is, of course, a big focus of our JOLT Effect study, it causes people to at minimum shop around. But again, it does feel like there's this sort of wide dispersion of expertise, more and more boutiques out there, more and more ways for them to access and learn from those different elements, and they're taking advantage of it for sure.
Yeah, that sounds that sounds very plausible, and obviously that's what you found. So when you decided to do this study, what was your actual process of doing it?
Yeah, so this was a combination of a big survey that we developed. So, roughly 45 to 60-minute behavioral survey for partners inside of professional services organizations. You can imagine their time is worth quite a bit of money, if you will. And so getting firms to sign up for this and getting them to recruit partners for this and to endure and go through the survey was no small task. And that took a bit of time and attention. And the survey itself was pretty in-depth. It covered a wide range of the types of things you might want them to focus on from a business development perspective, but also forced them to make trade-offs in the process of taking the survey. We sort of used different instruments to make sure that we were isolating the specific preferences they might have in given situations and what have you. So no small task to get them to take that survey. We then paired that with two different aspects, well, three really, I guess. So interviews of some of those top performing partners. We conducted close to 100 of those. I was doing a lot of those myself. And so learning from these individuals, we got a lot of the what do they do in the survey. The interviews allowed us to understand more why do they do what they do, the color behind and the thought process, the mindset they bring to their sort of go-to-market approach. Then interviewed also firm leaders, and managing partners, chief business development officers, those individuals. That became especially true as we got into the book phase and learned more about that dynamics from a cultural and incentive perspective, about how they would look to develop these individuals. And then, as I mentioned, we also had a separate survey for clients, along with some interviews with some buyers, C-suite purchasers who often will buy big professional services engagements.
Before we move on to a little more depth, I have a quick question. Did you find buyers are actually equipped to do this buying, or are they sort of winging it pretty much the same way they're buying hard goods and software?
Yeah, we didn't see all that many differences in terms of like how they evaluate these types of services. Obviously, the cycle times for these things differ. There is no real cycle time for a professional services relationship, and I don't want to call them lacking monogamy, if you will, but of course you can be married to and date lots of different providers at the same time. Whereas with a B2B service in a given category, you likely are working with one specific vendor, at any given time. And so, for example, if you're a general counsel, you might be working with 10 different law firms, on a variety of different matters, and just the proportion of that work might change over time. And so, because of that, the nature of that relationship is always sort of an ongoing aspect, and that both complicates things, but also opens up opportunity too, right, for new entrants to get in for one specific thing and then grow that relationship over time.
Right. Because it's a completely different set of expertise, right? As against buying raw materials for, say, a chocolate factory, you are buying legal service, which may have much bigger implications for you and the company. So that's where I was coming from.
Sure, the stakes could be quite big, absolutely, depending on the situation. I mean, you could hire these individuals for small stakes type consulting projects all the way through to business critical, lawsuits, to your point, or big strategy shifts that you're engaging in, or CEO hires that they're make or break type hires for your organizations. Yeah, so the stakes can matter. I think more critically, though, it's much harder in a professional services purchase to demonstrate the value prior to that purchase, right? It's a little bit more of a leap of faith, that you do in fact have this expertise, that past this prologue, that the work you've done in the past will translate to the next project, and that will continue to have this type of success. Even things like, hey, if you hire me, I'm going to be doing the work versus I'm going to farm this out to my team, which is a very common technique in professional services firms as they gain leverage, and scale, is like they've got Rainmakers who come in and win the business, and then somebody else goes and execute it. So there's a whole set of considerations you might have on making sure that the promises you're making in that sales process, which isn't really a sales process, are going to come to fruition. Whereas in a B2B purchase, you have a much more defined sense for, hey, I can demonstrate you can demonstrate your product to me. I can sometimes get my hands on it. I can do free trials. I can do POCs. There's other ways that I can sort of try to, get a sense for whether the promises you're making are real or not.
Absolutely. So tell me, this is a lot of data, right? So it's not trivial amount. It's a lot of data that you have collected. What was your writing process like? So you're four of you who co-authored this book. How did the structuring, how did that whole thing happen?
Yeah. Well, in total, this is probably like a 18 months to 2-year process overall. The designing the survey, putting it out in the field, collecting the data, making sense of the data as it came back, conducting all these interviews, and then more generally kind of understanding the story itself. There's a separate aspect so some of your listeners might have seen in fall of 2023, we had an article in Harvard Business Review that was sort of a digest version of that initial study. The book goes into much, much more depth, especially with respect to the mindsets and the development program you might put in place to build more of the winning profile, if you will. But the point being is the work and the effort was in different phases. And different people, the four of us contributed at different junctures in different ways. So initially, the three or four of us were helping to design the survey. I was the one conducting a lot of the interviews. We had a whole quant team that was helping on the data side of things to make sure that we were generating the right analysis, building the right data models and predictive models, and making sense of that. We had a whole separate team at DCM Insights that's helping to take action on these findings and gain stories and examples and situations of these individuals out in firms. As we got into the writing phase for the book itself, Matt Dixon, my co-author, was sort of the lead project manager, if you will, on the book, partly because we're also all have day jobs as well, working with our clients to sort of help them from a training and advisory perspective. And then we each took different parts of the book is kind of how it ended up working. So I had some of the firm level implication type stuff. Karen had a lot of the core development stuff. Rory is probably the biggest activator you've ever met. And so he was able to lend his own experience and expertise as well throughout the process. And so it was a very collaborative exercise.
Wonderful. Before we move into the book, you found like 5 different personas, right? Which you in the partners who are into this process. Was it sort of apparent quickly, or what I mean is that was it sort of leaping out as you looked at the data that, hey, these are this neat 5 stacks, or was it a bit messy and you sort of figured it out eventually?
Yeah. Well, so we designed the study initially with the intention of trying to arrive at discrete profiles that would pop out of the data. That's why we ran what we call a factor, what statisticians would call a factor analysis as part of the analysis. And there were questions designed. We had what's called max diff type questions and analysis in the survey as a way to get to that point. But that's, there's some messiness, of course, you start to understand the data, and there's statistical relevance you have to work through. And at one point there were 6 profiles, and then there were 4, and then there were 5. And so you're trying to kind of make sense of what feels most representative of the data. And so, but it wasn't that long. It didn't take all that long to see. These are pretty clearly defined separate personas. Now, the way these things work is, think about it when you go to kind of university or college, you've got a set of kind of core curriculum that everyone takes, and then you've got kind of majors out there in the world. These profiles aren't mutually exclusive. So one profile might have some core distinguishing characteristics that's kind of like their major, right? That's the primary way in which they might go to market, but they're going to borrow from and do some of the things that the other profiles will as well. And so we can get into what that means, the implication of it. But that does create some analytic messiness in the beginning.
Right. And was it surprising that you found that actually 4 out of the 5 were sort of losing their efficacy, and there was only 1 out of 5? I mean, it could have been 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5, right? So
yeah.
Was that sort of a surprise, or was that something you are getting a sense of as you are going through these conversations and the interviews and the data?
Yeah, so we ran 2 separate sets of analysis. As I mentioned earlier, we did the factor analysis, which allowed us to statistically cleave the data. It's like, think about it, if you were just to throw a bunch of data points up in the air and they were to fall down on the ground, where would they cluster and clump together? That's what the factor analysis allowed us to do. But then we also ran a predictive analysis with regression to be able to understand from a future perspective, what would their performance be if you were to essentially lean harder into one of those profiles and make that more of your go-to-market approach. And so that was surprising. And the fact that one was so clearly the winner was surprising on at least 2 different fronts. One was it's very rare in big studies like this. I mean, we collected data on, more than 2,000 partners in these professional services firms, every vertical you can think of, law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, talent advisory, you name it. And so it's very rare that you see such a clear winner come out of the data. That of the five, only one was positive. All the others were negative in terms of potential performance. But also the difference was so big. The second thing that was surprising though was some of the profiles that we found that were coming in last or close to last were types of individuals that many firms had kind of placed bets on, if you will, over time in terms of the profile they would have expected to do well, or perhaps the profile that in a different context, in a prior world where buyers maybe are a little bit more loyal and do rely more on those sort of old relationships, might have had more success, but that success is waning, it would appear based on the data.
And was there any evidence that the activators were a certain kind of age or education? Was there something like that, or was it a mental state, mental makeup kind of thing?
Yeah, well, so as part of the study, we controlled for all the demographic type things, even firmographic type things that might potentially influence. So we controlled for age and gender and geography and of course industry vertical, what have you. There are some differences in terms of the natural predisposition or the natural number of people who kind of fit in these profiles based on the market they work in. We can talk about that. But with respect to the activator, that's the winning profile for the audience. With respect to their success, we didn't see that many, really any difference across those different profiles. Now, part of the reason for that is that we didn't test for personality drivers, mostly because those things are just really hard to change. So we focus more on demonstrable behaviors, skills, mindsets, and things that you can actually shift and move over time. And so, yeah, that's kind of how the analysis worked.
Right. So if we jump into the book at this point, the very first chapter, let's attack that, because I think that will be of great interest for folks who are listening to this. So why do activators win? I mean, that's your chapter, right?
Yeah. Well, so let me touch on that, and then we can back up on what are the other profiles, because I think the contrast is interesting. And I would guess a lot of your audience works in core B2B sales, and so I'll say two things before we jump in there. One, there are a fair number of parallels that I think we can apply more generally as we think about sales and how client and customer loyalty is evolving. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are definitely themes that we feel like are carrying over from some of our previous studies around JOLT and Indecision, de-risking in general. But also think about, like, you work with these providers. A lot of your people are C-suite executives who buy these types of services too, right? So it's interesting to think about what types of people do they prefer to work with and do they want to work with. So with that as pretext, the activators, the big thing about activators is kind of a super connector, right? So they're out there. They do have a wide and diverse network that they cultivate over time, and they look to add and flow value across that network over time. So they're carrying insights through that network. They're really good at making introductions to people across that network. They're really good about cross-selling and upselling inside of their firm. I'll dive in a moment deeper into what the activator is doing, but contrast that with what some of the other profiles that the data tells us characterizes how these partners kind of go to market. So one profile we call the expert. So think about the expert as kind of the reluctant business developer. These are the people who, didn't go to law school, or their mindset is anyway, I didn't go to law school or business school to become a salesperson. I did that because I wanted to be that professional. And so their preference when they go to market is to attract people to their very specific niche expertise. So consequently, by the time the client is aware of the fact they have a need and they go looking for the top experts, there's a number of people they've already spoken to. And so these people find themselves in very competitive pursuits pretty often. But they sort of go to market by trying to get on stages and do talks and do thought leadership and just attract people to kind of their expertise. Next one over is the confidant. So think about the confidant as sort of that classic old school trusted advisor. I think all providers of professional services strive to be that trusted advisor. Right? So the question is, how do you be that trusted advisor? And the confidant is kind of that old school, very classic version of that, where they kind of have a very small, very tight set of client relationships that go very deep and go way back. Sometimes all the way back to when they were in law school or business school or what have you. And these individuals tend to kind of build a moat around these clients and try to distinguish themselves with white glove service, on the assumption that if I do great work, they ought to come back to me. That's my best way to go and develop business. And they also tend to have, very myopic focus on senior people. Like I try to anchor as senior as I possibly can get, again, on the assumption these are the people who make decisions and who I have relationships with. So that's a confidant. There's the debater. The debater. So for those of you in your audience that are familiar with our previous work around the Challenger sale, this goes back a couple of decades, a couple of jobs ago for Matt and myself, Karen as well. Rory was there during the Challenger days as well. The debater is doing a lot of things that the Challenger would have done. Not all of them. Some of the Activator is doing some insight-driven things we can talk about, but think about the debater as kind of the contrarian, on the team stylistically. They kind of always have a different perspective of the world. They're always looking to share that perspective, have the customer kind of follow their lead along the way. And so that's kind of the debater. And then finally, you get the realist. So the realist is this person who looks to distinguish themselves by being this very honest, very transparent individual who's comfortable discussing budget and money with their customers, protecting their team's time and making sure that they're not going to overpromise in certain situations. So those are the 5 kind of profiles. As we said earlier, activators far outperform other individuals. You do see high performers in any one of those 5. So there are people probably listening here who think, well, hey, I'm a confidant or I'm an expert and I'm a high performer. And yeah, the data would say that, in fact, that's very likely to happen. The question for most other people is, look, 80% plus of people in your firm aren't these activators. And yet the data is very clear that leaning harder and more often in any other direction besides the activator was likely to engender negative return with respect to output and winning more business. And so what's the takeaway, of course, is what can any of us do to lean kind of harder and more often in that direction that we think is more likely to have success tomorrow rather than today? And that's the activator profile.
It's time for a short break. Stay with us. After the break,
you kind of, make partner, get a book of business, and then are handed that and say, okay, go and do what you can to generate business. And they're kind of left to their own devices to figure out, how do I go about doing this? And of course, that's often just based on what you've observed in your firm, or the mentor that you might have who you sort of sell the way that they have sold, or perhaps you just have a comfort factor and you kind of go in that lane. The point being, there's not a lot of intention typically and strategy in helping them think this is the best possible way to go about and the most efficient way to be a high performer.
You are listening to a Business Podcast Network original. Podcasting is the fastest growing content marketing opportunity, which is untapped. We can help you craft your audio strategy and help leverage the wide reach and easy streaming capability that the smartphone penetration provides. It is easy, it is powerful and personal. Talk to us to find out how podcasting can help you build your brand and reach out to your targets like never before. Write to us at bpn@bizcast.in. That is bpn@bizcast.in. Business Podcast Network. Podcasts end to end. Welcome back. I'm Shubhanjan Sarkar, your host for Bits About Books and founder of PitchLink, the buyer-seller engagement platform. Let's dive right back into the episode where we left it. Are these like neat 20% groups, or is it like activators are like little more in number or less in number in terms of percentage of the entire set of people in a firm? I mean, is it sort of equally divided, or is it you see that there are more debaters and more realists or whatever?
In most firms, on an average, you tend to see a pretty even split of individuals across all five of those profiles. Part of that reason, by the way, is I think when most firms, the way that they tend to, frankly, kind of train and equip people from a commercial development perspective is you kind of, make partner, get a book of business, and then are handed that and say, okay, go and do what you can to generate business. And they're kind of left to their own devices to figure out, how do I go about doing this? And of course, that's often just based on what you've observed in your firm, or the mentor that you might have who you sort of sell the way that they have sold, or perhaps you just have a comfort factor and you kind of go in that lane. The point being, there's not a lot of intention typically and strategy in helping them think this is the best possible way to go about and the most efficient way to be a high performer. So you do tend to see a pretty even split across the board. There are some verticals where you see some spikes. You might see in investment banking a fair number of debaters out there, where they're sort of trying to win the deal and sort of be that contrarian in the market. In executive search and talent advisory, you tend to see a lot of activators, which might not be that surprising. They do sort of rely a little bit more on their network, more so than some of these other folks. But accounting and law, you tend to see very big spikes in confidants. People, again, who are sort of looking to create that very, very tight, very deep set of small set of relationships with their clients.
Right. So let's dig a little more into the activator profile. You have very specific data that talks about their commitment and process of business development, as well as building relationships, right? And one key thing that I read is that they're also possibly the most effective collaborators. So these are the three sort of characteristics that they bring to the table. Elaborate a little more. What are these characteristics when they're talking about business development, relationship development, and collaboration?
Yeah. What the data tells us is that activators kind of do three big things that distinguish themselves from others. So first, they have a really deep commitment to business development. Now, most professional services people are quite busy executing their day jobs, right? They're trying the cases, they're conducting the audit, they're running the project that they've won for consulting. And so they tend to treat business development as a separate thing that they do when they have time to do it. It tends to be very sporadic in nature, episodic. I'll get to it when I'm done with this project or I'm done with this matter. Activators are very regular, almost metronomic in their habitual commitment to business development over time, partly because they recognize there is some degree of relationship decay that happens with my core clients if I'm not in their lives often enough. And so they have a system in place that's very, again, very regular in nature. Now, there's probably people here thinking, well, how can they make time for it? We can get to that part of it. But that's one key distinguishing factor is they view in many ways their time conducting business development is making them a better lawyer, a better accountant, a better consultant, because they're learning about their client's business. They understand more about the dynamics of their job and their market. And so they then therefore provide better advice. So it's not separate from my job. It is a core part of my job. That's the first piece, is a commitment. The second thing they're doing is they're connecting in a very deep way. And to your point, often this is viewed as collaboration, which is part of it. It's internal collaboration, which requires me to understand more about the people in my firm, their expertise, so that I can position it well for my clients. But their network works on multiple dimensions. Yes, internally to my firm, but also inside of my client's organization, up and down their organization. You hear activators talk about zipper type relationships where they're anchoring people inside their firm and inside their client's firm up and down to make sure that they've got a very strong relationship with people at all different levels of those organizations. And then, of course, third-party individuals across their network who can be useful and valuable for people in their network. So you hear lawyers recommending accountants, accountants recommending lawyers, consultants who are sort of on the radar of people, investment bankers that they can make recommendations to, even real estate, individuals for people. One of the key core data points you find for activators is that they make very regular introductions for people across their value. So they think about part of the value creation process is in fact my ability to almost general contract expertise for you, my client, across my network. Right? That is a way, the fact that I can harness that expertise is in and of itself a form of expertise. And so that's how they think about that connection piece. There's a lot more detail in the book about how they cultivate their network, how they prioritize and qualify their network, how they sort of standardize, how they make use of things like events and LinkedIn and other forums as a way to cultivate that, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into it, but that's the intention behind it. And then finally, they create value in a very proactive way, right? So they're looking to flow that value, flow that insight through their network. They're regular in providing insight and reaching out to their people in their network about news, about regulatory changes, about insights that should cross their radar. And again, they use that as a way to take those connections they've made and turn those into conversations and then turn those into business, right? That's how they think about the use of those value creation activities.
Two quick questions before I would, because you mentioned LinkedIn, I thought that will be a good place to talk about Katie Vickery, because you talk about her use of LinkedIn quite extensively. But I have two questions before that. One is that when they are doing this in a very intentional manner, in the sense of the business development part, does that sort of reduce their actually billable time? And do you see any scenario that typically activators are maybe billing at a higher rate than the rest? Is there any such thing that came out from the study?
Well, so I should mention the way that we tested for high performance. I mean, it was firm provided, but we asked for a battery of data on that front. So yes, it's possible that total output could be influenced by higher fees, but we also tested for things like win rates, as well as the total number of clients. Right. And we tested for net new business versus existing business. And so it was sort of a composite view of performance. Yes. And so a long way of saying there isn't necessarily evidence that activators succeed because they have higher fees. I think it's fair to hypothesize that when they go to provide that value and as they go to work with their clients, they could in fact get higher fees because clients want to work with them. But they also win business on a more regular basis, right? Which is kind of the core part of their job. Or of the reason they're successful. And I'm forgetting the second part of your question.
No, I mean, do they bill less? Because if they're dedicating time to business development, then is their billing time? I mean, that's where I linked that maybe they're charging more. But you do say that they possibly are winning more. Please continue.
Yeah. So that's part of it, right? So it's interesting. We talk in the book, when you interview activators, we had one activator go so far as to say she spends 100% of her time on business development, which of course couldn't possibly be true because they have expectations for execution and for billing, but it was a purposeful exaggeration because in her mind, she would double count in many respects. Like when I'm executing this piece of business, I'm also trying to learn about that person and their business, and then using that as a way to generate new potential opportunities, at the same time. And so you can use that time as you're executing as a way to think about and generate that next potential opportunity. But in terms of time spent, no, that is a common, I think, first perception of activators is that they're just rainmakers out there spending all of their time selling and doing none of the execution. That's not what we found. They find time and they're far more efficient in their business development time for it. So yes, they have a greater commitment to it, but we're talking degrees of difference in terms of, they might spend a couple more percentage points of time relative to others, but they're just also way more regular, way more habitual, and far more efficient in that time. And then we could talk about where do you find that time, right? So it's when I'm walking the dog in the morning or what have you. So they're looking for nooks and crannies to find that time.
Yeah, I can sort of understand where, I mean, a lot of it obviously boils down to the mindset of what they're trying to do and what's important for them. I guess that's where it sort of spins from. You did, I think some of the points you mentioned do talk about how activators create value in terms of in the process of building relationship and in process of building those bridges, which will essentially help them turn more customers. Let's talk about the moments that matter as an activator. So what are these signals that they're looking for, which sort of prompt them to act or do things that they do?
Yeah. Well, look, I think at the end of the day, they think about where and how can I create value for people in my network more broadly. And so I think about that from the personal standpoint. So, how can I think about that individual's job and their career and their team? To think about it from the business standpoint, about the way in which the direction that the client's business is moving and how we can help influence those outcomes. And they think about more generally, like, how can I find ways to demonstrate to this client over time that I can be trusted, that I'm an expert, and then we're going to do great work. And so they take the long view in that point of view, right? So because that cycle never really ends, they're very disciplined about understanding the potential in that client value and how that might mean me prioritizing my time. You mentioned earlier about billable time. Well, one common thing you hear about, like firm leaders might wonder, well, gosh, if they're going to be spending all of this time and essentially unbillable time until they win that business, are we just giving away free consulting or free insight? And so it's true that activators need to be careful about who they spend their time with, how they look to generate that value and converting that value into conversations and into winning business. But what you also won't hear activators do is shy away from sharing some of that insight and being valuable even before they've won that business. Right? They very much believe this isn't a zero-sum game. And if I give you that idea, sure, you might go shop that around with other people, but I'm going to get credit eventually for the fact that I brought you that idea. And the more ideas I bring to you, the more value you'll see and the more you'll want to spend time with me. And so I say that because it is true. There are specific moments, we could talk about pitches and we could talk about when they lose business and how they look about ways to extend that relationship in those moments and establish a little bit of trust. We could talk about how they navigate stakeholders inside organizations, but more broadly, they think about this as an always on sort of value flow for people in their network. And so again, that's sort of the mindset that they bring to be proactive and sort of be always on in that respect.
I would actually love to sort of deep dive into a couple of those, but tell me from your findings, how immutable is this? How replicable is this? Because you touched upon it in the beginning, that it's something that you were looking for things that were transferable and not just okay because he's athletic in physically athletic, so he gets to do that. So how transferable is this?
So I'm going to answer that in three ways. I want to land at what are some things we can extrapolate into sales more broadly, even outside the context of professional services. But with respect to activators inside of professional services firms, as I mentioned earlier, we're testing for demonstrable behaviors and skills and less so personality. So these are things you can take and adopt and move, even if it's not instinctual for you to be that activator. Even if you don't view yourself as this extrovert, you still can find ways to, and there's plenty of introverted activators, right? They find a way to make it work. There also, I should mention, the predictive model, we found a linear relationship there that was really unique, which is that literally in every single incremental additional effort that you put into being more of an activator, you're going to see a little bit of return. So like, think about it like this. You could be a terrible activator and going from terrible to just okay, you're going to see return. You can go from just okay to pretty good and you're going to see return. You could be a great activator and still get better. That's what the data would tell us. And so we talk about, when you talk about being an activator, that's on relative terms, right? So I might not be an activator, but I can lean a little harder, a little more often in that direction. And I will see some return there. More broadly, though, as you think about kind of adopting the sort of activator mindset in sales more broadly, I think there is a common theme, and those are your audience that might remember our previous episode on the JOLT effect and the role of the fear of messing up that plays so heavily on buyers. You do see a lot of what activators are doing is kind of de-risking change for their buyers in the same way that you saw JOLT sellers do it. They might do it a little differently, I should say, because they're selling a different type of service, but the intention and how they're doing it is quite different. How they look to create value in a way that demystifies what's going to come next. How they look to make sure that they're demonstrating the trust and the value that they're going to get and accrue from the relationship. And so you do see a lot of parallels there, which tells us, hey, now we have two separate studies in two different verticals seeing similar types of things. And we see thousands of people every day acting like this, which gives us confidence that, in fact, your audience can take up and adopt these behaviors too.
Right. Is this change, if an organization is looking at adopting the methodology, say, that you have unearthed in this research, is this a strategic shift or is it a tactical one like many of the past methods were?
I think I think what you're kind of getting to is, does this indicate another era or another sort of large shift in purchasing? I think the big distinction I make here is the study was aimed at professional services. So you're talking about doer sellers and buyers who buy those types of services. And so in that respect, I wouldn't paint it as a big new era or a big new shift. I think when you take into consideration, are several different studies across the last 5 or 6 years or so including, the JOLT model, as you might remember, was 2.5 million calls, 8,000 plus variables, giant study of sales losses. And then combine that with some other now new findings about more broadly how clients want to work with providers, how they make decisions, and their continued decline in loyalty. There are some things you can draw from those two studies and wonder, right? So for example, the debater profile finishes last in this study in Activator. And yes, while it's true, these people are selling their own expertise and they are doer sellers and they're selling, intangible goods like advice and versus a tangible B2B good. You do wonder when you look at some of the findings from the JOLT study, for example, about how hammering that sort of relitigating the status quo, using that pain-focused, fear-focused sale in situations when that buyer was hesitating, that it was backfiring. And you combine that with the fact that contrarians are finishing kind of last in this new study. It does make you wonder if some of that take control element that a challenger might use might be waning in potential effectiveness there. And the way in which so that's one potential sort of shift. I will say this is a new study that, just like JOLT, confirmed that buyers value insight. They want insight. They want to be educated. The question is, how do we go about doing that? Right. And so one thing, for example, that activators are doing that we think is pretty interesting is that the way they think about insight is not so formal and finished as we might have thought in the early challenger days. So they think about insight as being, hey, I thought of you for this because of that. And so they're looking to distribute. We had somebody put it really nicely, which is that activators use more of their mouse than their keyboard. They're sort of distributing out different pieces of information. They're being insightful, without waiting until they have this perfect finished kernel of insight that they go and wow their customer with, right? So it's more about not so much quantity, because you still need to be insightful and there has to be high quality insight, but nonetheless they think about the distribution of that insight across their network in a different way. Then, hey, let's nail this pitch deck and make sure we're wowing them with this big, huge disagreement about their world being very different. And so it's just a different way to kind of think about insight. I think the last thing I'd say is these trends that we talked about 10, 15, 20 years ago with Challenger about highly educated buyers, and especially I think as groups make decisions, that story is still playing out in B2B sales about, what happens when buyers go to try to educate themselves, how that creates this entrenched belief set that comes in as essentially objections that start from the very beginning. So in B2B sales, we see this a lot now, very kind of almost combative type of interactions. And then how do you handle this situation where the buyer, they start to get almost too educated on certain issues to the point where they start to spin into analysis paralysis and become their own worst enemy, at that point. So more information, more people, it doesn't necessarily do them favors in evaluating that process, creates more hesitation than anything else. The answer there, of course, is not educate them less or provide less insight. The question is, how do I provide that insight? And so that's a story that's still unfolding that we're tracking with research.
Wonderful. Let's wrap this up with one story. You choose which one you want to tell about one of the subjects that you spoke with, where you came back with a aha feeling.
Gosh, there's so many. I think some of the best stories actually were from non-activators, from people. Like one of our favorite quotes of the whole study is this confidant who told us, their sort of go-to-market approach was, stay close to your friends and turn 40. Was sort of their approach to it, which I love. Look, I think the activators that stand out in our mind, are the ones who are thinking about, how can I make sure that I am understanding enough about my customers, my clients, and my network and the people around it, so that I can make sure my expertise, they view their expertise set as part of this is about harnessing other people's expertise. And so you hear these stories about, dinners they might set up, or introductions that they might make, or specific meetings where they've brought two people together and walked away and accrued benefit because of the fact that they made those introductions, right? And they view that as a big part of their expertise. And then there's stories in the article and in the book about a bunch of activators who are really thoughtful about the system they've put in place, or about the introductions they've made for colleagues across the firm. And so it's a powerful story, a set of stories, and we're just always grateful when people are willing to share.
Bits About Books is brought to you by PitchLink, the buyer-seller engagement platform. PitchLink makes buying easy by enabling high-quality engagement between buyers and sellers through its presentation and discussion modules. Sellers create customized sales narratives using sales collaterals and personal videos, and reach out to prospects through a non-intrusive, buyer-qualified engagement. PitchLink requires no installation or download and holds the entire repository of sales collaterals and buyer-seller conversations. Talk to us to know more about how you can engage with customers without intrusion. Call us on 99021 631 32.
Ted, thank you so much. This was a wonderful chat, and I can't wait to read the book. As you know, I do that post-interview. And I think there is a lot of usable insights that people can take away, irrespective of whether they're in a consulting business or not. I think this potentially gives you ideas to do a broader study with broader B2B sales, I guess, maybe, and see if the activator advantage actually plays out in those sectors as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And as you might expect, our clients in our B2B sales clients are always asking us, hey, what is the latest and greatest you're finding, and what might that mean for our teams? And so I'd encourage anyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to have that conversation.
Absolutely. We have a great lineup of authors like Charles Green, Geoff Birch, Peter Cohen, Stu Hynek, Enrico Gallorini, Brad David Ball, Tahira Endine, and Ramli John over the next few episodes with insightful conversations on breakthrough books on sales, marketing, business, and events. Subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you do not miss a single episode. Thanks for listening. Thank you for being with us today on Bits About Books, where we talk to authors about breakthrough books on sales, marketing, and business. We hope this conversation helped inform and motivate as we all navigate a rapidly changing business environment. For us, these are enlightening conversations enriched with knowledge and expertise. We encourage you to go out and buy the book to learn firsthand and implement some of the great ideas we discussed today. We hope to have you with us again in the next exciting episode of Bits About Books. If you liked what you heard, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast platforms like iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast from, and give us a rating while you are at it.
This Bizcast original podcast is produced for PitchLink, the next generation buyer-seller engagement platform, where the mission is to make buying easy. Hosted by Subhanjan Sarkar and produced by Rajiv Aditya. See you next time and have a wonderful day.